The humid air of late June 1999 hung heavy over Portland, a palpable hum of anticipation and the promise of endless summer nights. For Liam O'Connell and Chloe Davis, it was more than just another summer. It was the precipice of everything new, the beginning of their lives beyond the confines of high school. The graduation ceremony, a blur of caps and gowns and tearful goodbyes, had barely ended before they were on Liam's vintage Harley, its chrome glinting under the setting sun. Their destination was the rugged coast, a place of wild beauty and secrets. Specifically an old, forgotten fisherman's shack tucked away near a treacherous stretch of cliffs known only to a few. It was their sanctuary, their place to dream and plan. They roared away from the celebratory lights of town, leaving behind the well-meaning hugs and parental advice. The wind whipped through Chloe's hair, a cascade of sun-streaked blonde against Liam's leather jacket as they raced towards the distant roar of the ocean. The air grew cooler, carrying the briny scent of salt and seaweed and the faint cries of gulls. They imagined a night under the stars mapping out their future, a future where they would conquer the world together. The old shack, weather-beaten and leaning precariously, offered them a quiet escape, a place where their youthful exuberance felt boundless, untouched by the mundane. They were last seen by a passing fisherman, a grizzled old-timer who merely nodded as they vanished down the winding coastal road, disappearing into the twilight. The dawn broke over Portland with a gentle, indifferent light, but the usual rhythm of the town felt subtly off. Hours stretched into a disquieting silence. The sun climbed higher, warming the dew-kissed rooftops, but Liam and Chloe did not return. Their families, initially dismissing it as an impulsive post-graduation adventure, soon found their casual concern curdling into a cold dread. Calls went unanswered. Their friends had no answers. The old fisherman, when questioned, simply shrugged, remembering only a fleeting glimpse of the pair heading towards the isolated coastline. Panic spread like wildfire, a suffocating smoke through the tight-knit community. Search parties were organized, their hopeful calls echoing across the desolate beaches and through the dense pine forests, but the vastness of the Pacific seemed to swallow all hope. Days bled into weeks, and the initial fervor of the search began to wane, replaced by a weary resignation. Without a trace, without a single clue to their fate, a narrative began to form. Whispered at first, then openly declared, they had run away. It was a convenient, if heartbreaking, explanation, easier to bear than the chilling alternative. The image of the adventurous, free-spirited couple, disappearing into the unknown, served as a balm for a town that preferred its tragedies neatly categorized. The official investigation, hampered by the lack of physical evidence, quickly ran out of leads. The local police, overwhelmed and understaffed, eventually closed the case, marking it as a probable runaway. The families, left with an unbearable void, were forced to grapple with a grief that had no closure, no finality. And as the seasons turned and new stories eclipsed the old, the memory of Liam and Chloe, two bright stars extinguished too soon, began to fade, becoming little more than a whisper in the winds that swept over the Portland coast. The passage of 20 years had smoothed over the rough edges of collective memory in Portland, but not for everyone. For Stacey O'Connell, the passage of time had only intensified the ache of absence, crystallizing the image of her older brother Liam, forever young, forever gone. She had built a life far from the coastal whispers of Portland, but the news, carried on the relentless currents of the internet, found her regardless. A grainy photograph, lifted from a local news site, flashed across her screen. A mangled mass of rusted metal, undeniably the skeleton of a motorcycle. The very air seemed to thin around her. Even after 2 decades, the distinctive curves, the remnants of custom paint, it was his, Liam's Harley. The same one he had ridden away on that suffocatingly hopeful June night, promising a quick return. The accompanying news headline, stark and uncompromising, announced the discovery of a motorcycle by a fishing trawler off the coast of Portland, reigniting a cold case from 1999. It was a cold case for the town, perhaps, but for Stacy it had always been a gaping, unhealed wound. The initial surge of shock quickly morphed into a fierce, almost vengeful resolve. For 20 years she had carried the unspoken burden of her family's quiet suffering, the dismissive shrugs of those who believed her brother simply abandoned them. Now, with this tangible piece of their past dragged from the depths, a new possibility, however terrifying, shimmered into existence. Answers. She booked a flight to Portland, leaving behind the carefully constructed normalcy of her life, drawn by an invisible current back to the place where her family's world had shattered. The city, once a vibrant backdrop to her childhood, now seemed to pulse with a melancholic energy, each familiar street corner holding a ghost. The salty air, once a comfort, now tasted of loss. She felt the weight of 2 decades of unanswered questions pressing down on her, but beneath it, a nascent flicker of hope. This wasn't just a rusted relic, it was a hook, pulled from the dark, silent depths, threatening to drag untold truths to the surface. It was time to return, to stir the dormant waters, and finally, after all these years, demand the truth that had been buried along with the memory of Liam and Chloe. The old O'Connell house in Portland stood like a sentinel, its clapboard siding faded, the porch swing still, a silent testament to the years that had passed since Liam's disappearance. For Stacy, returning to its familiar, yet strangely foreign embrace was like stepping into a time capsule, each creak of the floorboards, each dust motile dancing in the sunbeams, a painful echo of a life interrupted. Her parents, gaunt and stoic, greeted her with a quiet embrace, their eyes holding the weariness of 2 decades of unresolved grief. The motorcycle's discovery, a cruel twist of fate, had ripped open wounds that had never truly healed. The local news, with its relentless pursuit of tragedy, had already turned the O'Connells' quiet suffering into a public spectacle. Reporters camped outside the house, their microphones thrust forward, their cameras flashing, transforming their private sorrow into a morbid curiosity. It was a stark reminder of why Stacy had fled Portland years ago, seeking anonymity in a city where her family's name didn't immediately conjure images of vanished youth. Yet, the same relentless media attention that had once repelled her now offered a strange, unexpected flicker of hope. The story of Liam and Chloe, once relegated to the dusty archives of local lore, was suddenly alive again, echoing across every platform, forcing the town to confront its uncomfortable past. The following morning, a crisp autumn chill bit at the air, carrying the scent of drying leaves and distant wood smoke. Stacy, fueled by restless energy, made her way to the Portland Police Department. The building, a squat brick structure, felt imposing, a bastion of forgotten files and unanswered questions. Inside, the atmosphere was sterile, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and old paper. She was directed to Detective Aaron Reed, a man whose name she had seen splashed across the news reports. He was younger than she expected, with an earnest gaze and a quiet intensity that suggested a detachment from the town's intricate web of old loyalties and hushed secrets. He was an outsider, a fresh pair of eyes, and in him Stacy found a glimmer of possibility. Detective Reed laid out the few fragmented pieces of evidence they had. The motorcycle, now carefully secured in a police impound lot, was a mangled husk of what it once was. Its discovery confirmed Liam and Chloe had indeed gone over the cliff, not run away, but it offered no explanation why. No obvious signs of collision, no other vehicles involved. Just the bike and the chilling implication that 2 lives had simply plummeted into the abyss. He spoke of the initial investigation from 1999, his voice laced with an understated skepticism. The records, he admitted, were sparse, almost suspiciously so. Key witness statements from that era were either missing or heavily redacted, obscured by the bureaucratic dust of 20 years, It was as if someone had deliberately tried to erase the path Liam and Chloe had taken. For Stacy, this was the first tangible proof of what she had always suspected. There was more to their disappearance than a simple, tragic accident. The chilling silence of the past began to speak, hinting at a truth far more complex and far more sinister than a teenage runaway fantasy. The initial optimism Stacy felt after her meeting with Detective Reed began to curdle into a familiar frustration as the days in Portland stretched on. The police department, despite Reed's apparent earnestness, moved with the ponderous slowness of a ship caught in a dense fog. Every request for further information, every suggestion she made, seemed to get lost in a labyrinth of bureaucratic procedures and polite deferrals. She found herself staring at the missing police reports, or rather, the glaring lack of them, with a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just inefficiency, it felt like a deliberate erasure, a meticulous scrubbing of any details that might shed light on that fateful night. The absence of specific witness statements, the lack of any comprehensive search records beyond the initial superficial sweeps, it all pointed to a carefully orchestrated cover-up, a chilling realization that settled heavily in Stacy's gut. She decided to take matters into her own hands, embracing the tenacity that had always defined her. She started by revisiting the few people mentioned in the scant remaining police notes. Her first stop was the old fisherman Gus, who had supposedly seen Liam and Chloe heading towards the shack. She found him by the docks, a weathered figure mending nets, his face a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles. He remembered the couple, vaguely, a flash of youth and a roaring engine disappearing into the coastal twilight. But when pressed for details, his eyes would dart nervously, his answers becoming evasive. He mumbled about the darkness, the fog that often rolled in, making it hard to see anything clearly. His discomfort was palpable, a tremor in his voice, a tightness around his eyes that suggested more than just a failing memory. He clearly knew something, or suspected something, that he was unwilling to articulate. Next, Stacy sought out Chloe's former best friend, Sarah, who still lived in Portland. Sarah, now a tired-looking woman with circles under her eyes, welcomed Stacy with a weary sympathy. They sat in Sarah's small, cluttered kitchen, the air thick with unspoken grief. Sarah spoke of Chloe's dreams, her vibrant personality, her unwavering loyalty to Liam. But when Stacy delicately steered the conversation towards the night of the disappearance, a wall went up. Sarah's eyes clouded over, and she suddenly became agitated, insisting that Chloe and Liam had always talked about running away, escaping the small-town life. It was a common enough fantasy for teenagers, but the vehemence with which Sarah clung to this narrative, despite the newly discovered motorcycle, struck Stacy as odd, almost defensive. There was a flicker of something in Sarah's eyes, a fleeting shadow that suggested fear, not just sorrow. Stacy sensed that Sarah, too, was either holding back information or had been convinced of a version of events that served to protect someone else. As Stacy continued her quiet investigation, a pattern began to emerge. Every person she spoke to, every old friend or acquaintance of Liam and Chloe, seemed to carry a collective, unspoken secret. Their stories, though varied in their details, always converged on the idea of the couple escaping, a convenient fiction that had allowed the town to move on. The underlying tension was almost tangible, a pervasive sense that asking too many questions was a transgression, an unwelcome disturbance of a fragile peace. The initial search in 1999 had been brief, perfunctory even, focusing more on land than the treacherous waters, as if the local authorities had been predisposed to believe the runaway theory from the start. It was a deeply unsettling realization for Stacy. The town hadn't simply forgotten Liam and Chloe, it had actively chosen to forget, or perhaps to suppress, the truth of their disappearance. Meanwhile, Detective Reed, despite the subtle pressure from within his own department to move on, found himself increasingly intrigued by Stacy's quiet determination and the glaring inconsistencies she unearthed. He pulled the sparse 1999 police file again, comparing the original handwritten notes with the digitized and redacted versions. The discrepancies were more than just clerical errors. Key dates were shifted, names omitted, and entire sections describing initial witness interviews were missing. It was clear that someone, at some level, had deliberately sanitized the official record. His gaze lingered on the name of the officer who had signed off on the initial investigation. Captain Robert Hayes, now retired, but a long-standing figure in Portland's law enforcement, a man known for his unwavering loyalty to the community's established order. The pieces of the puzzle, though still scattered, were slowly beginning to connect, forming an outline of a story far more troubling than a simple, tragic accident. Stacy's quest for answers led her down winding paths through Portland's quiet neighborhoods, past the familiar Victorian homes and sleepy storefronts that seemed to hold their secrets close. Each conversation, each blank stare or evasive answer, solidified her conviction that the town was not just forgetting, but actively protecting a long-buried truth. The more she pushed, the more the subtle resistance stiffened, like an invisible wall rising around her. She felt eyes on her as she walked through town, a quiet disapproval in the casual glances of shopkeepers and neighbors. It was the weight of small-town gossip and the fierce, insular loyalty that often comes with it, a collective instinct to preserve a convenient peace, even if it meant burying uncomfortable realities. Her focus shifted to the person Detective Reed had flagged, Captain Robert Hayes. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose image graced plaques in the police station and who was a regular at town hall meetings. Approaching him directly felt like wading into a deep, murky pool. She tried first to speak with him through official channels, but her calls went unanswered, her messages unreturned. Undeterred, Stacy decided on a more direct approach. She found his address in an old phone book at her parents' house and drove to his quiet, well-maintained home on the outskirts of town. The house was large and imposing, surrounded by manicured lawn, a stark contrast to the weathered coastal shacks and bustling fishing docks. When she rang the doorbell, a man in his late 60s, with a stern face and a shock of silver hair, answered. This was Robert Hayes. His eyes, though faded with age, still held a sharp, assessing glint. He recognized her instantly, the daughter of the O'Connells, the ghost of a painful past. His demeanor was polite but distant, like a locked door. He listened to her questions about Liam and Chloe, about the discrepancies in the old case files, with a practiced impassivity. His responses were clipped, rehearsed. The case was closed, a tragic accident. The police did everything they could. Sometimes kids just run away. He spoke of the inherent dangers of the coast, the unpredictable tides, the slippery cliffs. He offered condolences, a hollow gesture that felt more like a dismissal. Yet, despite his controlled exterior, Stacy noticed subtle tells. His hands resting on the doorframe were clenched tight. His gaze, though direct, would flicker away whenever she mentioned the missing reports or the lack of a proper marine search. He attributed it to the chaos of a busy summer, limited resources, and the prevailing assumption that the teenagers had simply fled. His explanations were plausible on the surface, but a chilling undercurrent of unease rippled beneath them. He was too smooth, too rehearsed. There was a story in his eyes, a flicker of something he desperately wanted to keep hidden. Stacy left his doorstep with a knot of frustration in her stomach, but also with a strengthened resolve. Hayes was involved. He knew something, or someone, was being protected. Back at the police station, Detective Reed had been making his own quiet inquiries. The more he dug into Captain Hayes's past, the more he uncovered a pattern of fierce protectiveness over certain individuals, particularly a younger brother, Mark Hayes, who had a history of trouble with the law. Minor infractions mostly, but enough to raise an eyebrow. Mark had been known for his volatile temper and his possessive nature, especially concerning women he fixated on. Reed also discovered that Mark had been involved in a minor traffic incident that very same night in 1999, not far from the coast. The incident had been quickly dismissed, chalked up to drunken driving, and no further investigation pursued. The coincidence felt too stark to be ignored. Reed quietly arranged for a complete re-examination of the motorcycle, requesting a deep forensic analysis for any hidden clues. The initial police report had been cursory, but with modern technology, perhaps something new could be found. He also began to discreetly interview officers who had worked under Hayes in 1999, treading carefully, knowing that loyalty ran deep in a small-town police force. Most were reluctant to speak, offering only vague recollections. But one, an old desk sergeant on the verge of retirement, his conscience perhaps finally weighing on him, hinted at a rushed investigation, a directive from higher up to close the case quickly. He spoke of an uncomfortable feeling at the time, but he had been a junior officer and questions were not encouraged. The pieces were still fragmented, but a disturbing image was beginning to form. A respected figure, a hidden family secret, and a truth carefully buried beneath 2 decades of silence. The chill that had settled over Portland wasn't just from the autumn air. It was the icy breath of a past refusing to stay buried. Stacy felt it in the guarded glances, the sudden silences when she entered a room, the thinly veiled disapproval in the eyes of longtime residents. Her presence, a relentless reminder of the town's most enduring mystery, was an unwelcome disruption to the carefully constructed facade of peace. The narrative of Liam and Chloe as runaway dreamers, however comforting, was beginning to crack under the weight of the freshly unearthed motorcycle and Stacy's unwavering pursuit of answers. One afternoon, a package arrived at her parents' house, unassuming and unmarked. Inside, wrapped in a faded newspaper from 1999, was a small, crudely drawn map of the coastal area, with a specific spot near the old fisherman's shack circled in red ink. Accompanying it was a single anonymous note, typewritten, "Look deeper. The old man knows more than he lets on." Stacy's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. Someone was finally breaking rank, risking their own comfort to offer a piece of the truth. The map pointed to a secluded cove, barely visible from the main road, hidden by a dense thicket of gnarled pines and jagged rocks. It was a place no one had mentioned in the initial searches, a forgotten corner of the coastline. She immediately contacted Detective Reed, her voice tight with suppressed excitement. He agreed to meet her, his own skepticism slowly eroding under the mounting weight of inconsistencies. They drove together to the marked location, the narrow, winding road barely a track, overgrown with thorny bushes. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves as they navigated the treacherous path. The roar of the ocean, muted by the trees, grew louder as they approached the hidden cove. The cove itself was a desolate stretch of pebbled beach, battered by years of relentless waves. At one end, almost swallowed by the encroaching foliage, stood the crumbling remains of an old, abandoned boathouse, its timbers warped and rotting, its windows long shattered. The structure exuded an eerie silence, a place where time had simply stopped. The anonymous map had been precise. The circled spot was not on the beach itself, but nestled in the shadows of the boathouse. As they approached, a sense of foreboding settled over Stacy. The air felt colder here, the silence more profound. Detective Reed, his flashlight cutting through the gloom, meticulously scanned the interior of the dilapidated structure. Dust motes danced in the beam, illuminating cobweb-draped corners and the skeletal remains of old fishing gear. Then, in a small, recessed alcove, almost hidden by a stack of decaying lobster traps, they found it. A small, waterproof box, weathered but intact. Reed, with gloved hands, carefully pried open the lid. Inside, nestled amongst layers of dry sand, were several items that sent a jolt through Stacy's entire being. A faded denim jacket, unmistakably Liam's, still bearing the faint scent of his old cologne. A silver locket, tarnished but recognizable, the one Chloe always wore, a gift from her grandmother. And beneath them, carefully preserved, was a small, leather-bound journal. It was Chloe's. Stacy's fingers trembled as she took the journal. The cover was worn smooth, and the pages, though brittle, were still legible. It was filled with Chloe's neat looping handwriting, recounting her dreams, her fears, her passionate love for Liam. But as Stacy flipped through the final entries, her breath caught in her throat. The entries grew increasingly desperate, detailing a chilling escalation of unwanted attention from Mark Hayes, Captain Robert Hayes's younger brother. Chloe wrote of his obsession, his possessive calls, his unwanted appearances. The entries spoke of a growing fear, a desperate desire to escape Portland, to disappear with Liam to a place where they could be truly free. The last entry, dated the very night of their disappearance, was a frantic plea for safety, a terrified confession that Mark had found them at the old fisherman's shack, his rage simmering just beneath the surface. He had followed them there, convinced that Liam was taking Chloe away from him. The silence in the boathouse was absolute, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the shore. The cold reality of what they had discovered hung heavy in the air. This wasn't an accident. This was a crime, and the truth, hidden for 2 decades, had finally begun to reveal itself in the most desolate, forgotten corner of Portland. The full weight of the tragedy, far more sinister than a simple runaway fantasy, settled upon Stacy and Reed, galvanizing their resolve to finally bring justice to Liam and Chloe. The journal, Chloe's final desperate plea for understanding, lay open on Detective Reed's desk, its fragile pages a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the police station. Stacy sat opposite him, her face pale, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. The words Chloe had penned 2 decades ago painted a chilling picture. Mark Hayes, not just an acquaintance but a relentless, menacing presence in Chloe's life, his infatuation twisting into an unhealthy obsession. The diary detailed his unwelcome appearances at her work, his unsettling phone calls, the way his gaze followed her everywhere in their small town. He had become a shadow, a source of constant anxiety that even Liam's protective presence couldn't fully dispel. The final entry, scrawled with a desperate urgency, described the moment Mark had found them at the old fisherman's shack, a place they believed to be their sanctuary. Chloe's terror was palpable on the page as she recounted his sudden appearance, his face contorted by a jealous rage, his voice a low, menacing growl. They had planned to leave that night to escape Portland and Mark's suffocating grip, but he had intercepted them, his fury boiling over as he saw his imagined future with Chloe slipping away. The entry ended abruptly, a testament to the sudden violent interruption of their lives. Detective Reed's face, usually composed, was etched with a grim determination. The journal provided not just a motive, but a horrifying narrative that corroborated the physical evidence. The motorcycle found at the bottom of the cliff, the absence of any signs of a road accident, and the distinct lack of a proper investigation. It all clicked into place, forming a disturbing mosaic of a crime deliberately concealed. He knew, with an unsettling certainty, that they were no longer dealing with a simple runaway case or a tragic accident. They were looking at a murder, and a decades-long cover-up orchestrated by a man who had used his position of authority to protect his family. The immediate next step was clear: confront Robert Hayes. Reed understood the delicate nature of this confrontation. Robert Hayes was not just a retired police captain. He was an institution in Portland, a man whose reputation was as solid as the granite cliffs. To accuse him would send shockwaves through the community, and without irrefutable proof, it could backfire spectacularly, jeopardizing the entire investigation. But with Chloe's journal, they had the crucial missing piece. As they drove to Robert Hayes' house, the tension in the car was thick, almost suffocating. The tranquil suburban streets seemed to mock the dark purpose of their visit. When they arrived, the meticulously manicured lawn and the imposing facade of the house seemed to mock the dark purpose of their visit. This time, there was no polite knock on the door. Reed, his face set, used his authority, the weight of his badge, to demand entry. Robert Hayes, surprised by their sudden appearance, was visibly shaken. His initial composure crumbled, replaced by a nervous tremor that betrayed his carefully constructed facade. He tried to maintain his authoritative air, but his voice wavered and his eyes darted nervously between Stacy and Reed, clinging to any shred of plausible deniability. Reed laid the journal on the polished surface of Hayes's coffee table. The sight of Chloe's distinctive handwriting, the unmistakable locket, seemed to drain all color from the old man's face. Stacy's voice, though quiet, was filled with a burning intensity. She read aloud the final harrowing entries from Chloe's journal, her voice steady despite the raw emotion churning within her. As each word of Chloe's fear and Mark's escalating aggression filled the room, Robert Hayes visibly withered. The sternness in his eyes dissolved into a haunted, defeated look. He tried to interrupt, to deny, to deflect, but his protests were weak, his denials hollow. The truth, finally, was too heavy to bear. The careful edifice he had built over 2 decades began to crumble, exposing the terrifying secret he had protected with such ruthless determination. The silence that followed Stacy's reading was deafening, punctuated only by the ragged sound of Robert Hayes's breathing. The game was over. The truth, once unearthed, spread like wildfire through Portland. The small town, which had so carefully constructed a narrative of tragic escape, found its foundations crumbling under the weight of a far more sinister reality. News of Robert Hayes's confession, quickly followed by the discovery of Chloe's journal, ripped through the community, turning hushed whispers into outraged shouts. The cozy facade of quiet seaside life shattered, revealing layers of complicity and fear that had festered beneath the surface for 2 decades. Stacy felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. The relief of finally knowing the truth was immense, a heavy burden lifted from her shoulders. Yet it was a bitter victory, purchased at the cost of unimaginable pain for both her family and Chloe's. The public's reaction was immediate and visceral. Neighbors who had once offered empty platitudes now looked at the O'Connells with a new, horrified understanding. The very people who had perpetuated the runaway myth, either through ignorance or complicity, now grappled with the uncomfortable realization that they had, in their own way, been part of the cover-up. Meanwhile, Detective Reed, armed with Robert Hayes's confession and Chloe's damning journal, moved swiftly to apprehend Mark Hayes. The younger Hayes, now a bloated, middle-aged man with a perpetually aggrieved expression, was found at a dilapidated bar on the outskirts of town, still clinging to the same destructive patterns that had defined his youth. He offered no resistance, only a muttered string of incoherent curses, the bravado of his past replaced by a pathetic resentment. His arrest, though expected, sent a fresh wave of shock through the town. The good family image of the Hayes brothers, long maintained by Robert's influence, was irrevocably shattered. The local media, sensing a story of immense public interest, descended upon Portland like a flock of hungry gulls. National news outlets soon followed, their cameras and microphones transforming the quiet coastal town into a chaotic circus. The narrative of Liam and Chloe, once a forgotten local tragedy, became a national story of betrayal, obsession, and justice delayed. The police department, once criticized for its inertia, now found itself under intense scrutiny, its past actions, or rather its inactions, dissected and condemned. Detective Reed, initially an outsider, was hailed as a hero, his quiet determination lauded by a public hungry for a tale of redemption. But for Stacy, the focus remained on the 2 lives stolen so violently. She sat with Detective Reed for hours, meticulously going over every detail of the recovered journal, piecing together the last moments of Liam and Chloe's lives. Chloe's words painted a vivid, agonizing picture. Mark's sudden appearance, his furious shouts, the desperate attempt by Liam to protect Chloe, the ensuing struggle at the precipice of the cliff, and then the terrifying plunge of the motorcycle carrying both Liam and Chloe into the dark, unforgiving waters below. Robert Hayes's confession corroborated this account, his voice, though choked with shame and regret, admitting to the horrific decisions he had made in the immediate aftermath to protect his brother. He described how he had arrived at the scene shortly after, finding Mark in a state of panicked delirium, and how, in a moment of warped familial loyalty, he had chosen to suppress the truth, to manipulate the investigation, to allow a convenient lie to take root. The search for Liam and Chloe's remains intensified, now with a precise location guided by Robert Hayes's reluctant admissions and the new understanding of the cliff's treacherous currents. Divers were deployed, working tirelessly in the cold, murky waters where the motorcycle had been found. The hope was grim, but it was hope nonetheless. The hope for a final, dignified farewell. The town watched, a collective breath held as the search continued, a somber procession of boats and equipment marking the sea's surface, a poignant reminder of the lives tragically cut short so many years ago. The silence of 2 decades was finally being broken, replaced by the relentless churn of the waves and the quiet determination to bring 2 lost souls home. The days that followed Mark Hayes' arrest were a blur of intense activity for Detective Reed. The small Portland police station, usually a quiet hub of minor incidents and routine paperwork, became a nexus of national attention. Forensic teams descended upon the old fisherman's shack and the hidden boathouse, meticulously sifting through every inch, searching for any lingering traces of the 2-decades-old crime. Divers, braving the cold, unforgiving waters off the coast, continued their grim search, their efforts now focused on the exact spot where the motorcycle had been found, guided by the currents and the new details provided by Robert Hayes. For Stacy, the waiting was almost unbearable. The truth was out, the perpetrators identified, but the ultimate closure remained elusive. She spent her days at her parents' house, fielding calls from journalists, her voice hoarse from recounting the story again and again. Each retelling, while painful, solidified the reality of what had happened, giving voice to Liam and Chloe, who had been silenced for so long. Her parents, initially consumed by a quiet, internalized grief, now found a strange kind of peace in the communal outpouring of sympathy and outrage. The years of quiet suffering, of enduring whispered judgments were finally over. The preliminary findings from the forensic analysis of the old boathouse began to trickle in. Though 2 decades had passed, and the salt air and dampness had taken their toll, dedicated work uncovered a few crucial details. Faint bloodstains, degraded but still identifiable as human, were found on a section of the boathouse floor near where Chloe's journal had been hidden. A struggle had indeed taken place there, confirming Chloe's harrowing final entry. Fragments of a distinct type of glass, consistent with an old-fashioned whiskey bottle, were also recovered, hinting at Mark Hayes's presence and state of mind that night. These small, yet significant pieces of evidence began to paint a more complete picture of the violent encounter. Meanwhile, the divers continued their methodical search of the ocean floor near the cliff. The currents were strong, the visibility poor, but their perseverance was unwavering. And then, after days of painstaking effort, a breakthrough. Deep within a submerged crevice, tangled amongst kelp and rock, they found human remains. Skeletal fragments meticulously recovered and carefully brought to the surface. The news sent a somber wave through Portland. It was a moment of profound sadness, yet also of a grim relief. After 20 years, Liam and Chloe were finally, tragically, coming home. The identification process was swift. Dental records and DNA samples, compared with those from their families, confirmed the identities. The remains belonged to Liam O'Connell and Chloe Davis. Their long journey in the cold, dark depths of the ocean was over. The official cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma, consistent with a fall from a significant height, and drowning. The evidence, though grim, was conclusive. It was no accident. It was murder. The discovery brought a new wave of public attention. Memorials were organized, candles lit, and flowers placed at the base of the cliffs. The town, once so eager to forget, now collectively grieved, its sense of guilt palpable. The local church, a silent witness to countless joys and sorrows, became a focal point for the community's reckoning. People came not just to mourn Liam and Chloe, but to silently acknowledge their own complicity in the decades of silence, their collective failure to question the easy narrative. For Stacy, holding the few carefully preserved personal effects recovered with the remains, a small tarnished ring that Liam always wore, a button from Chloe's favorite denim shirt, was an overwhelming experience. These were not just objects, they were tangible links to the vibrant lives that had been so cruelly taken. The tears she had held back for so long finally flowed, a torrent of grief and a release of the suffocating weight of years of uncertainty. The confirmation of their deaths, while devastating, provided a form of painful closure. They were no longer missing. They were gone, but their story was finally being told, and justice, however delayed, was within reach. The grand jury indictment for Mark Hayes, charging him with 2 counts of murder, came swiftly, setting the stage for a trial that would force Portland to confront its darkest secrets in the full glare of the public eye. The atmosphere in the Portland County Courthouse was electric, a palpable hum of anticipation and barely suppressed tension. The trial of Mark Hayes, and by extension the implicit judgment of Robert Hayes's decades of deceit, had transformed the quiet coastal town into a national focal point. Every seat in the courtroom was filled, not just by concerned citizens of Portland, but by reporters from every major news outlet, their pens poised, their cameras flashing, until strictly prohibited by the judge, eager to capture every twist and turn of a story that had captivated the nation. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, polished wood, and the nervous energy of hundreds of converging gazes. Stacy sat in the front row, a silent sentinel, her gaze fixed on Mark Hayes. He looked smaller, diminished by the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom, his face devoid of the aggressive swagger she remembered from Chloe's journal entries. He sat beside his defense attorney, a sleek, expensive lawyer from out of town whose efforts to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative seemed futile against the mounting tide of evidence. Robert Hayes, gaunt and stoic, sat a few rows behind his brother, a figure of profound shame and regret, his once formidable presence now shrunken by the weight of his actions. The prosecution, led by a sharp, methodical district attorney, presented their case with a chilling precision. They began by establishing the relationship between Liam and Chloe, painting a picture of 2 bright, promising lives on the cusp of adulthood, their dreams tragically cut short. Old photographs were displayed on a large screen. Liam, with his easy smile and restless energy. Chloe, radiant and full of life. The images, vibrant and full of hope, served as a stark contrast to the grim details that followed. The first witnesses were the O'Connell and Davis families, their voices thick with grief, yet resolute in their desire for justice. They spoke of the initial agonizing days of searching, the crushing disappointment when the runaway theory took hold, and the 2 decades of lingering uncertainty that had haunted their lives. Stacy, when called to the stand, recounted her own relentless search, her gut feeling that something was deeply wrong, and the chilling discovery of Chloe's journal. Her voice, though steady, conveyed the deep emotional toll of her journey, painting a vivid picture of a sister's unwavering love and a quest for truth against seemingly insurmountable odds. Detective Reed took the stand, his testimony methodical and compelling. He detailed the reopened investigation, the inconsistencies in the original police reports and the deliberate obfuscation by Robert Hayes. He meticulously laid out the forensic evidence, the identified human remains, the cause of death, the location where the motorcycle was found, correlating it with the specific details from Chloe's journal. He explained how modern technology had allowed them to uncover the faded bloodstains and glass fragments in the boathouse, tying Mark directly to the scene of the struggle. His testimony was a powerful indictment of not just Mark Hayes, but of the systemic failure that had allowed the truth to remain buried for so long. The heart of the prosecution's case, however, was Chloe's journal. Pages were projected onto the screen, Chloe's delicate handwriting filling the courtroom with her final terrified words. The prosecutor read excerpts aloud, Chloe's voice, though absent, resonating with a chilling clarity. The description of Mark's escalating obsession, his violent jealousy, and his sudden appearance at the shack that fateful night painted a vivid and horrifying picture for the jury. Each word seemed to land with the force of a hammer blow, exposing the deep-seated malice that had led to the tragedy. The jury, many of them members of the Portland community, listened with rapt attention, their faces grim, a silent acknowledgment of the terrible truth unfolding before them. The defense, despite their efforts to discredit the journal as a fanciful diary and to portray Mark as a troubled, misunderstood individual, found their arguments crumbling under the weight of the undeniable evidence and the raw, emotional power of Chloe's last written words. The prosecution's final witness was a figure of profound sorrow and reluctant bravery, Robert Hayes. His appearance in court sent a ripple of murmurs through the packed gallery. Once a respected pillar of the community, he now entered the courtroom a disgraced man, his shoulders slumped, his eyes refusing to meet anyone's gaze. His testimony was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle, confirming every horrific detail that Chloe's journal had revealed. He spoke in a low, trembling voice, recounting the events of that fateful night in 1999. He described receiving a frantic, incoherent call from his brother, Mark, shortly after midnight. There was a panic in Mark's voice, a chilling mix of fear and rage. Robert, driven by an instinct he now deeply regretted, had rushed to the old fisherman's shack. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his days. He described the scene. The mangled motorcycle teetering precariously on the edge of the cliff, its engine still smoking faintly. Mark, disheveled and wild-eyed, standing nearby, muttering about Liam and Chloe trying to leave, about his right to Chloe. Robert recalled seeing the sheer terror in Mark's eyes, the unhinged desperation that had driven him to such an act. He spoke of his brother's confession, whispered in a fit of drunken panic, the confrontation, the struggle, the moment Liam, in a desperate attempt to protect Chloe, had lunged at Mark, causing the motorcycle to lose balance and plunge over the cliff with both of them on it. A gasp went through the courtroom as Robert Hayes recounted how he had then, in a moment of catastrophic moral failure, chosen to protect his brother. He described scrambling down the treacherous cliff face, confirming that Liam and Chloe were gone, swallowed by the unforgiving ocean. He then methodically set about erasing any trace of what had truly happened. He returned to the shack, wiping down surfaces, kicking loose rocks over the edge to obscure any potential skid marks, and then, most damningly, returning to the police station to systematically redact and remove crucial pieces of evidence from the official records. He explained how he had spread the rumor of their elopement, how he had used his authority to steer the investigation away from Mark, away from the truth, burying the horrifying reality beneath layers of fabricated convenience and carefully constructed lies. His voice cracked with emotion as he admitted to living with the crushing weight of his secret for 2 decades, watching the O'Connell and Davis families suffer, knowing the truth that could have brought them some measure of peace. The defense attorney, in his cross-examination, attempted to discredit Robert Hayes, portraying him as a man coerced by guilt, a witness seeking redemption at his brother's expense. He questioned Hayes's memory, his motivations, his mental state, but Robert Hayes, stripped bare of his pride and his reputation, simply repeated his confession, his voice unwavering in its newfound clarity. He had come to terms with his monumental mistake, and now no amount of legal maneuvering could shake him from his determined path towards honesty. The prosecution rested its case. The defense, despite their efforts to present an alternative narrative of a tragic accident, exacerbated by unfortunate coincidences, found themselves with little to offer against the combined weight of Chloe's diary, the forensic evidence, the recovered remains, and now the devastating testimony of Robert Hayes. The jury, a cross-section of Portland's residents, had listened intently, their faces etched with a mixture of shock, anger, and profound sadness. The The final image left in their minds was not of two runaways, but of two young lives violently snatched away, and the deliberate conspiracy that had kept their truth hidden for far too long. The courtroom adjourned, the silence that followed Robert Hayes' confession deafening, the echoes of his words hanging heavy in the air, a chilling testament to the devastating power of a buried secret. The jury's deliberation was agonizingly brief, a stark testament to the overwhelming weight of the evidence presented. The courtroom, which had hummed with activity for days, now held its breath in a profound, heavy silence. When the foreperson finally stood to deliver the verdict, the tension was palpable, each word hanging in the air like a pronouncement of fate. Guilty on 2 counts of murder in the first degree. The words rang out, clear and unwavering, sealing Mark Hayes' destiny. A collective sigh, a mixture of relief and sorrow, swept through the gallery. Stacy felt a tremor run through her. It wasn't the catharsis she had imagined, not a sudden burst of joy, but a quiet, profound sense of release. Justice, finally, had been served. Mark Hayes, his face devoid of expression, showed no outward reaction, his gaze fixed on some distant, unseen point. Robert Hayes, however, slumped further in his seat, his head bowed, the full weight of his brother's conviction and his own complicity, crushing him. The sentencing came a few weeks later. The judge, his voice somber, spoke of the heinous nature of the crime, the 2 young lives brutally taken, and the egregious act of a decades-long cover-up that had compounded the suffering of the victims' families. Mark Hayes received 2 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his days incarcerated. Robert Hayes, having cooperated with the prosecution after his initial confession, received a lesser but still significant sentence for obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact. His once sterling reputation was shattered, his legacy forever stained by his choices. The justice system, slow and often imperfect, had at last reached its conclusion for the Hayes brothers. For the O'Connell and Davis families, the verdicts brought a different kind of ending. It wasn't closure in the traditional sense, for the gaping hole left by Liam and Chloe's absence could never truly be filled. But it was an end to the agonizing uncertainty, an end to the whispered rumors, an end to the cruel charade of a runaway fantasy. The truth, raw and brutal, was finally out in the open, acknowledged by the law and by the community. They could begin the long, arduous process of grieving openly, without the shadow of doubt and the burden of unasked questions. The discovery of Liam and Chloe's remains had allowed for a proper burial, a ritual denied to them for so long. The funeral was held on a crisp autumn afternoon, the sky a clear, mournful blue. The small church, the same one where Liam and Chloe had shared so many childhood milestones, was overflowing. Friends, family, and even strangers from Portland, drawn by the tragedy and the eventual triumph of truth, came to pay their respects. 2 white caskets, adorned with flowers, lay at the front, symbols of innocence lost and lives reclaimed from the depths of the sea. Stacy stood beside her parents, her arm linked through her mother's, as the minister spoke of Liam and Chloe, not as victims, but as vibrant, loving souls whose spirits would forever remain etched in the heart of Portland. She looked out at the faces in the pews, seeing not just sorrow, but a newfound understanding, a collective acknowledgement of the town's past complicity. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the quiet sniffles of mourners. For the first time in 20 years, the families felt a sense of communal mourning, a shared burden of grief that was, in its own way, comforting. The long journey for justice, fraught with pain and frustration, had reached its poignant, bittersweet end, allowing Liam and Chloe to finally rest in peace. The trial's conclusion, while bringing legal closure, did not erase the deep scars etched upon the town of Portland. The public consciousness, once content with convenient fictions, was now forced to grapple with the profound trauma of lost innocence and betrayed trust. The old narratives of runaway teens, once whispered with a knowing shake of the head, had been replaced by the chilling truth of a senseless murder and a systemic cover-up. The air in Portland now felt different, heavier, as if the collective grief and the lingering sense of guilt hung palpably over the familiar streets. For Stacy, the verdict and the subsequent burial of Liam and Chloe brought a profound, albeit painful, sense of peace. The raw, searing pain remained, a constant ache, but it was no longer accompanied by the gnawing uncertainty, the desperate yearning for answers. She could now mourn openly, allowing the waves of grief to wash over her without the added burden of unresolved questions. She spent quiet afternoons at the newly erected memorial by the cliffs, a simple stone bench overlooking the vast, shimmering expanse of the ocean. It was a place where she could sit and remember Liam, not as a victim, but as her vibrant, protective older brother, full of dreams and laughter. She imagined him and Chloe, forever young, forever free, soaring over the very waters that had held their secrets for so long. Detective Aaron Reed, his part in the case concluded, found himself a quiet hero. His reputation as a tenacious and ethical officer solidified. The case of Liam and Chloe, which had initially been a cold file gathering dust, had become the defining moment of his career. He had peeled back the layers of deception, exposing the dark underbelly of a seemingly idyllic town, and in doing so, had brought a measure of justice to families who had lived in limbo for 2 decades. He received commendations, promotions were hinted at, but for Reed, the true reward lay in the quiet gratitude of the O'Connell and Davis families, in the knowledge that he had honored the memory of 2 young lives. He often visited the memorial by the cliffs, a quiet, contemplative figure, reflecting on the profound impact the case had on him, on the stark reminder of how easily truth could be buried, and how fiercely it sometimes needed to be fought for. The old fisherman's shack, once a symbol of the couple's youthful escapades and later a silent witness to their demise, eventually succumbed to the relentless march of time and the elements. Its decaying timbers finally collapsed into a pile of weathered wood, slowly being reclaimed by the earth and the encroaching coastal vegetation. The hidden boathouse, too, became part of the landscape's slow decay, its secrets now revealed, its dark purpose exposed. The physical remnants of the crime faded, but the story they told would forever be etched into the memory of Portland. As the seasons turned, the initial frenzy of media attention gradually subsided. Life in Portland, though irrevocably changed, slowly began to find a new rhythm. The painful truth, once confronted, allowed for a deeper healing to begin. Stacy eventually returned to her life away from Portland, but the town and the memories it held were no longer a source of unmitigated pain. She carried the lessons learned, the resilience forged in the crucible of her long search for truth. She would never truly move on from Liam and Chloe, for they were irrevocably part of her, but she could move forward, carrying their story, ensuring that their lives and the injustice they suffered would never again be forgotten. The waves of the Pacific continued to crash against the rugged Portland coast, a timeless rhythm, now carrying not just the whisper of the wind, but the echoes of a story finally told.